Mr. Altobello, thank you very much for joining me on this second episode of my new podcast called Getting to Know You. Our history is intersected in 1999 in AP history class in my 8th grade year. My brother, of course, was taught by you a few years earlier than that. He's 7 years older than I am, so he was likely in college by the time you met me. Please introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us what you do.
Well, my name is Brian Altobello. I am semi-retired. So I have a couple of things going on, so I don't feel I'm retired. So I'm still pretty busy, but I'm retired from my full-time job, and that is in the profession of education.
Okay. Well, we'll backtrack a few years. I believe at one point you were born to two parents, possibly some siblings.
Yeah, I have a couple of kids and two grandkids, as a matter of fact, now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, when were you born?
1948, so I'm 74.
48. Okay. What did your parents do at that time?
My father was an independent insurance agent. My mother was just a housewife.
Okay. How many siblings did you have?
One younger brother, career Army guy.
Okay.
He's retired now as well.
Good for him. But
yeah.
All right. So let's say you're into grade school. Were you drawn to any certain subjects growing up?
Yeah, from the very beginning, Tim, I always read history, particularly Civil War history. My little bookcase when I was a kid was filled with Civil War nonfiction books of various kinds. So I was always drawn to the Civil War. World War II came later, but military history has always been an interest of mine.
What was
it came just naturally. I don't know if my parents didn't influence me. It was just one of those intrinsic things that I happened to develop. Okay.
Oh, what was the main draw of the Civil War for you?
I don't know. I found it fascinating. I think I saw myself as a real Southerner. I think felt I'm married to the Confederate cause. As a kid, it was a romantic interest of mine. It's no longer. That romanticism has faded, but it was when I was a kid. And I read Bruce Catton mostly, and he tended to like a lot of authors in the 1960s, he tended to romanticize the war, particularly the Southern effort.
Okay, and I don't know that you mentioned it. Where were you born?
In New Orleans.
What part?
I grew up in Lakeview.
Okay.
So I went to school, elementary school, just a block and a half from my house, St. Dominic's School. So Catholic education all the way through, high school at De La Salle. And thereafter, then I went into the service. I was LSU ROTC. So I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army. Then I did my 2 years in the Army and came back and went to grad school at LSU. And then also was teaching part-time back at my alma mater.
Okay.
So I got my master's in 1976.
Okay. And alma mater, grade school or high school?
At De La Salle. De La Salle.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I was in during the Vietnam War, really at the end of the war. So troops were being pulled out while I was on the way in. And it may be interesting to know that my feelings about the Vietnam War changed a great deal, especially after Kent State, because I identified more with the students than I did with the National Guard or the military, even though I was in the military.
Right.
And so I was, I respected and admired the military because I met some very bright, sharp people, and I still am good friends with one of them. We see each other at least once a year. He lives in Minneapolis. So that part of the Army I like, but the decision makers, Washington decision makers, I was not a fan of our effort there. And of course, it turned out that it was a total waste of money and particularly human lives.
Right. Right. So you get back. How long were you in Vietnam?
So I didn't go to Vietnam, but I was
Okay.
in the States during the war. But I
Okay.
never got orders overseas because at that time they were really pulling troops out. Nixon was president, and he was pulling troops out
And
every month. So
what
I
year was
came in.
this?
If I had gone in probably 2 months earlier, I probably would have had orders. But
What year would this have been?
1970 and 71.
Okay. I think actually
So that's when the pullout began.
my stepfather was in Vietnam, I think that year in the
Hmm.
Marine Corps. Interesting.
Okay.
So you finish up your service and you go straight into grad school.
That's right. Yeah, I used the GI Bill, went to graduate school at LSU, and I had finished my course requirements, started teaching back at De La Salle, finished my thesis, and graduated in January '72. Got my degree in January '72.
Okay.
Oh
How
no,
long?
January '73. Excuse me, '73. No,
Gotcha.
that's not right. I'm sorry, '76. I said
Okay.
that earlier. '76 is correct.
Gotcha. All right. And then, so how long were you teaching at De La Salle? Was that all history
10
courses?
years.
Was
10
that all?
years. And then I left because I was dissatisfied with the leadership at the school, and was angry at what he was doing. And I left in December, actually, at the end of the fall semester, and I got a job working uh, at Hanville High School. It was a sabbatical position. The lady had left for a semester. I took that job, and then I was hired in the summer of 80 of 80 83 at Archbishop Rummel. So I started Rummel actually in the summer of '83.
Okay. And then what courses did you teach, and did you get involved in strength coaching at that point?
No, I didn't. I mean, I was a distance runner for 30 years, 30
Okay.
plus years, run 5 marathons, ran dozens and dozens of road races for, again, almost really over 30 years.
Okay.
I still run, but not like the craziness that I was when I was really in competition. I stopped doing that, realized that I have to go into strength training at my age. It's better to be stronger than it is to have supreme cardiovascular health. I think you got to do both, but strength
Right.
training is more important once you reach 50.
Okay. I'll keep that in mind for a few years from now.
You should. Yeah.
Yes, sir. All right. So we're at Rummel. We're teaching. We, of course, encountered one another in 1999. Learned everything I could ever dream about Huey P. Long. Still have the book on the shelf.
Me
Um,
too.
Mine's has a few Sharpie marker marks all over it, but
Me too. Do that too.
Roger that.
Yeah.
So how long were you at Rummel?
I was at Rummel for 18 years, long time. And then I got a job. I was probably ready to move on. I was lucky enough to land a job with the State Department of Education. They were hiring 35 people throughout the state to be trained as change agents, and we were embedded in the lowest performing middle schools throughout the state to help essentially just to help them raise their scores
Okay.
on their standardized test score. So I went through it was a 6 different level process of interviews and performance tasks and whatever. And I managed to make the cut. And so I was assigned to a school in New Orleans East. It's called Livingston something else now, but it was just Livingston Middle School when I was there. And I was there for 5 years, the only white person in the entire school of 700 plus 6th through 8th graders and faculty.
Okay.
So it was daunting, to say the least.
What was what did you do there? What was your function?
Well, yeah, we would train, as I said, to try to improve their score. So We examined their lowest scores. What I did essentially was work with the teachers, and it turns out it was math for that school. And so I worked with all of the math teachers to try to see to visit their classes, to try to improve their instructional habits, and just look at everything that they did in the classroom, from the training, the training that we received. I was able to, to demonstrate to them in a way that had to be super diplomatic, given that I was an outsider and distrusted from the state, because the rumor was that they were going to close the school and they would lose their job. So they looked at me with a jaundiced eye, and it was a difficult thing to develop relationships. It took me really 2 years before I was able to develop relationships, and I started making slowly some inroads with the teachers. But you have to develop trust. They have to trust me first before they're going to accept any recommendations that I'm going to make.
Right.
So it was a long process, and we made incremental gains. There were 16 of us in the New Orleans area, because most of the low performing schools were in New Orleans, and all of us really had the same difficulties. But we made some gains, but nothing like the state had hoped for our program. And so when Katrina came, I was assigned to the Recovery School District in the central office, where I became the Social Studies Director of Curriculum and Instructions. We had 36 schools, and the Orleans Parish School Board basically was defunct. And so the Recovery School District, which was state-run, ran Orleans Parish schools. And that's when the charter schools began to come in. We began awarding charters to the different schools, and little by little, the standard traditional public schools began to fade away, and the power of the Orleans Parish School Board was no longer. So I was in that for several years. I had 160 or so social studies teachers that I would do professional development with them. I would visit their schools, visit their classrooms, just history.
Was that
Just
statewide?
social studies courses, not anything else, because that's all I did was social studies. I also wrote all of their standardized exams from third grade through high school. So they all took the same exam that I wrote, and that was my biggest time-consuming job, is writing all those exams.
Was that a statewide reach?
No, it was just in New Orleans.
Okay.
Recovery School District was just New Orleans. It doesn't exist any longer, because once the charters came in, we turned over most of the responsibility of running the schools to the charter organizations. And then there were fewer and fewer now schools for the Orleans Parish School Board to run. Now they have none. Basically they have a few functions, but the schools now fund themselves. They have their own budgets. They hire their own teachers, where, for example, it used to be, if you wanted a job in Orleans, you would have to go to the Orleans Parish School Board and interview, and then they would put you in a school. That's no longer the case. Now you interview directly with the school that you're interested in teaching in. So it's much better in many ways. And also another big thing was the union basically crumbled.
Okay. All right. Well, let's backtrack a little bit along the way, if you can fill in some context. You've written 3 books now, published 3 books, not just written. I'd love to know your experiences writing the first and second one, and then we'll get to your most recent one.
Yeah, the first one was it was a compilation of oral history. So I set about finding New Orleanians that had some experience in World War II, and I divided it into the home front, the Pacific Theater, and the European Theater. And I tried to get well-known folks. So I interviewed, for example, Archbishop Hannon when he was still the Archbishop. He was, by the way, an airborne ranger. He was in the 82nd Airborne, and he was dropped into France after Normandy, and he was very proud of that experience. So I interviewed him in his office. An interesting thing about that, I like to say, is that I went into the bishop's office, and the only way I got a chance to see him was because I told his people that I don't want to ask him any questions except his World War II experience. And so immediately he let me in, because he loved to talk about his World War II experience. And when I went in, there was a brass, like a 2-foot tall brass statue of an airborne ranger on his desk. So
Okay.
it wasn't Jesus. It wasn't,
Right.
there were no holy statues. It was an airborne ranger on
Right.
his desk, which I find interesting. I also interviewed some TV personalities that you probably don't even know who they are because they're long gone, but Hap Glaude, Alec Gifford, who was a longtime Channel 6 WDSU TV reporter, people like that, amongst other people that were not well known, but they had interesting stories. So I sat there with them with a cassette tape recorder, transcribed their stories, and then typed them up and put it. I got somebody to actually put it together for me, and there it was. So it's called New Orleans Goes to War, 1941 to 1945.
What time frame would that have been? Year? What year?
I did that, let's see, in the mid to late 90s.
So you were still at Rummel?
Still at Rummel, yes.
Okay. How did you manage the demands of being a high school teacher with that?
Oh, I just did that on weekends and
Yeah.
such. I would make contact with people. It wasn't time consuming. I spent no longer than maybe 45 minutes with the person, and then when I had an opportunity, the tedious thing was to transcribe what they wrote.
Right.
Another guy, by the way, you may know about him, is the weather person.
Nash Roberts?
Nash Roberts. He had a very important role during the war. He actually was in the Navy. He taught at Loyola. He taught aerodynamics. But when he was sent overseas to the Pacific, he forecasted to the admiral there about this typhoon that was going to hit. And they actually did redesign the military, the Navy there, redesigned their plans based on his forecast. So he was he also he invented a device that allowed naval trainees to be able to target practice. There was a device that would be pulled by a plane, and this was on a tether, and the trainees would fire at this device, and it would dip and sway much like an aircraft would do. When he devised that, he was a really fascinating guy, a real scientist. So I was happy to get an interview with Nash Roberts.
Sure. Yeah, when you mentioned the old names, I didn't know those, but Nash Roberts came to mind. His legacy seems to live on during hurricane season, especially.
Yes.
So was Into the Shadows Furious written later?
Yes. Yeah.
And was that in any way tied to your brother's service?
Not at all. My brother's service really, and my father was a World War II vet, but neither one of those people had anything to do with that at all.
Okay.
I found this battle. It's a little island in the Solomons that no one had ever written about. And this was a 3-week plus assault, Allied assault on a Japanese held island. And there had been pieces of other books about this assault, but no one had ever done a book just about the assault on New Georgia Island. And that's really what attracted me. The other thing that attracted me was that the folks that the troops, the American troops that landed there, one particular regiment had the highest number of war neurosis casualties that any other regiment in the Pacific. Tremendous number. And today we call it PTSD, or we call it, very war neurosis. It could be shell shock in World War I is what they call it. And that fascinated me. I wanted to know why there were so many in that particular unit. So that's the reason I started my interest in it, to do something that had never been done before.
And what was that research and writing process for you?
Well, I visited several reunions, because at that time they still had folks that were alive that were able to give me competent interviews. I did the same thing. I interviewed these people on tape. So that was one thing. I also went to Washington to the National Archives, where the military records are held. So there's a ton of records there about the units that fought at New Georgia. Then I also went to Pennsylvania. What's the name of the town in Pennsylvania? The Military Historical Society has a facility there. And I can't think of the name. It's right outside of Gettysburg, but I can't think of the name right now. It's where It's where Jim Thorpe went to college. I don't know, the name escapes me, but that's another place I spent some time. Luckily, my brother was working at the Pentagon and at the time, so I was able to stay with him. So it didn't cost me a ton of money. So I would I would drive into Washington with him, and I would go to either the National Archives, which was in Maryland, near the University of Maryland, and then to Pennsylvania. So those were the key places.
What was your brother's job in the Pentagon?
When he retired from the military, he worked as a civilian liaison with the CIA. So he
Okay.
did I think it's 16 different tours to Afghanistan and about 8 to Iraq.
Okay.
So he worked closely with the military even after his retirement from the military.
What is he up to these days?
He's retired,
Yeah.
doesn't do anything.
Enjoying his life. Good for him.
Yeah, enjoying his grandkids. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So that does lead us up pretty simply to your most recent book, which is called Whiskey, Women, and War. Please share with the audience about that. And then I'd love to know more about how you pursued writing that one, because I will confess I'm only about 20 pages in, but it is on my it's on my nightstand, man.
That's a start. Okay, well, yeah, Whiskey, Women, and War, and the subtitle is How World War One Shaped Jim Crow New Orleans. So this is about World War One, but it's not about the war. Obviously, the war frames it, but it's about what happened in New Orleans during those 2 years of 1917 and 1918. And a lot of interesting things went on. I first got interested in it by my wife and I had visited the Historic New Orleans collection, and they had a gallery, they did some kind of exhibit on the anniversary of World War One in 2017, 100-year anniversary. And one of the things that interested me was a document that they had framed on the wall, and it was the document was a report written to a group of people called the American Protective League, which you will get to, and I think you'll find it interesting. I had never heard of this group before. I'd studied history. I had 2 degrees, never heard of this group, but there were
Right.
almost 250,000 people involved, members in this group. And essentially it was a government sanctioned vigilante group whose job was, first of all, at the outset, to identify anyone that might be traitorous, that might be a German sympathizer, might be a German saboteur, anyone that was deemed to be a threat, essentially somebody that was sent by Germany to do bad things during the war to us, or an American-born German sympathizer. When they turned out that didn't find many of those people, many of the saboteurs, they slowly began to morph into looking for other things that was against the war effort, according to the government. So the FBI, or the Bureau of Intelligence, as it was called back then, was very short-handed. So these 3 men from Chicago decided, okay, we're going to help the FBI, or the Bureau of Intelligence. So there were 3 wealthy guys, and they started to award badges to people in Chicago that would go out and kind of help the local police or the Bureau of Investigation looking for disloyal people. Then he went to Washington, talked to the Attorney General. The Attorney General said, let's make this a national organization, which they did. For $1, you could join. They would send you this official looking badge, which you could flash and show people, and that would, had some gravitas to it. And in New Orleans, they became a force looking for violations of laws that prohibited the serving of alcohol to soldiers. There was a Sunday drinking law, a Sunday closing law in New Orleans at that time. So saloons couldn't operate on Sundays, and there were all kinds of really, now looking back, ridiculous laws to try to restrict the sale of alcohol. This is before the Prohibition Amendment, but the dries in the country were very clever because they were able to link patriotism to the Prohibition movement, because so many Germans were brewers throughout the country. You think of a beer, you think of a German name. And so there was a really effective poster campaign that showed you the enemy, like the German, the Austro-Hungarian soldier, and then next to it was a bottle of booze.
Right.
So it was almost impossible to be a wet and still claim to be a patriot. So
Hmm.
that was one reason that the war really triggered the passage of the amendment, which went to effect right after the war was over. But the American Protective League, they weren't not supposed to have any kind of arrest powers, but they arrested people. They weren't supposed to carry weapons. They did. They broke into people's offices to search without warrants. And anyway, it was a very scary organization, and there were several thousand members over the period of 2 years in New Orleans, and the Bureau was very active. And I have a really a complete list of all of what they did, the arrests that they made and the reports that they wrote. But, if you didn't stand up quickly enough at the national anthem that was played before a movie at a theater, that was one possible cause for an APL guy who was sitting there to write a report about you. They would find out your address, and they'd send a report into the APL, and they may or may not bring you in for questioning. But there was another report that I talk about in one of my PowerPoint shows. This one man on a train was angry in the dining car because he wasn't allowed a second packet of sugar for his coffee. Of course, there were restrictions on sugar. It was restricted, among other things. And so his anger about that was enough for one APL agent to hear it and write a report saying that he was not patriotic. So it got to be really out of hand. They were loosey-goosey. There was no training for any of these people. Very dangerous. So that's one of the attractions I had when I saw that report. I went to Tulane's archives. They had a little bit about a few of the documents that I used came from Tulane. But I went to the National Guard archives at the Washington Artillery Center at Jackson Barracks. The Archdiocese of New Orleans had some good stuff in it that I was able to use. UNO had a couple of things that I was able to use, but most importantly, the Historic New Orleans collection had a ton of good stuff, particularly on the German presence in New Orleans, because they were really vilified, like they were everywhere in the country during the war. The Germania Society, which has become the Deutsches Haus in New Orleans, the Germania Society basically just stopped functioning. And it was a group of the leading Germans in town. Ironically, our Mayor Berman, was a German-born Jew who converted to Catholicism, but he himself was German. But he was certain. No one accused him of being unpatriotic. He was all over the place.
Right.
And so he was a 16-year mayor, elected 5 different times in the city. So I talk about him a good deal, and he did a really good job during those troubled times. And then the other thing was I talk about Jim Crow and how the recruitment of soldiers affected the African-American population. But in many ways, it was Jim Crow light in New Orleans, if there is ever such a status as that. But Mayor Berman had a day that he called Afro-American Day in New Orleans to pay tribute to the African-American soldiers who were drafted into the Army. Had a big parade for them. He stood there on Gallier Hall, tipped his hat to them as they marched by. So as far as I know, it's the only city in the South that paid that kind of tribute to the African-American soldiers there. But I also talk about other things about the difficulty that African Americans had once they got into the military, and in France, how white Americans looked upon the African Americans as more susceptible to German propaganda because of the situation they were in America. The Germans hoped to capitalize on that treatment and say, look, come over to our side. We treat our colored friends much better than you would be treated in America, that kind of thing. So I talk a good deal about that as well. And also I talk about jazz and how jazz was exported to France primarily with our African-American soldiers and musicians. We had several from New Orleans that played even after hours. They would go around and play for the French, and they absolutely loved it. Uh, and and of course, their relationship with white French women was was different for them than it would have been back in the United States. So that's addressed a bit in the book too. So Jim Crow flavors everything.
Right.
And then finally, the other big thing is the Women's Suffrage Amendment, which also the war gave momentum to that amendment's passage, and that also went into effect in 1920 as well. And that's because of the great contribution that women made during the war. So we all know about women in World War II, you know, Rosie the Riveter, but there was a Rosie the Riveter in World War I as well. But we
Right.
just didn't know. I mean, we were only in the war 19 months in World War One, where versus 4 years in World War II. So it
Right.
was just a quicker event for us, and so those kinds of things are fade in our memories.
Did Mayor Berman have a contentious relationship with the APL? Well, was anyone, were they ever successful in promoting or creating a dry parish down here?
Not that I'm aware of. Not in certainly not in the South. That would not have been popular. The legislature did approve passage of the 18th Amendment, which is a surprise. But if you know about Louisiana politics and probably Southern politics, the back in those days, rural parishes dominated the legislature. The urban parishes did not. They had many, many more representatives from, and so New Orleans, the vote from New Orleans and Baton Rouge, they were really in a minority there. And of course, those were the parishes that were wet, and so they were just outvoted. And of course, there's a funny thing I have in my book about once the vote to approve of the 18th Amendment was passed, the speaker, who was a wet, sarcastically called out, so you know, now all of our dry friends can go out and get tight to celebrate their victory, right? So they were going to go out and celebrate drinking booze.
Sure.
So you know, basically hypocrites.
Right.
Yeah. So no, there was no, as far as I know, no drive to make any parishes dry.
Right. I didn't figure as much. I would have been especially
No.
surprised had you said yes about Orleans Parish. So tell me about your publishing experience for your second and third books.
Yeah, well, for Into the Shadows Furious, there was a small military press called the Presidio Press from Presidio, California, that agreed to publish it. And the way to do this is there's a book uh, for publishers or prospective authors that it's a directory, and its name escapes me at the moment. Um, I can't think of it. I have it upstairs, but I can't think of it right now.
No
But
problem.
it's you can get it at any library, and it's a real thick volume. Looks like an old phone book with all of the information that a prospective author could need. So if you have a particular, let's say if you're a poet, then there's a whole section on publishers that publish poetry, and you can refine it even further. And it has all the information what they require for submissions, and everything you want to know about the publishing business in that, you know, in that particular genre. Of course, right now the publishing business is so in flux. Those books go out of date rather quickly because a lot of publishers, as you know, probably know, are merging, and but Presidio Press no longer exists, for example. But an easy process. I only had one editor. He wasn't great, and he made a lot of errors, and I sent a lot of stuff back to him. But very helpful, but not. This was not Simon and Schuster by any
Right.
stretch of the
Right.
imagination. But I was flattered that somebody had agreed to publish my book, and it didn't take a whole lot. I was really lucky. I didn't get a lot of refusals. Um,
How many
a lot of
publishers
times,
did you submit to?
I think 4 or 5. Uh, University of Kansas showed interest. I remember that they had come back and wanted me to send something else in. They showed interest, but then the Presidio Press was ready from the very start, so that's why I went with them. And I thought I had a choice between a commercial and a university press, and I thought the commercial press would do a better job of publicity, of pushing the book, because they were profit based and the other was not. So I went with them.
Do
But
you,
I was really lucky, Tim. I didn't. I mean, I hear horror stories about people that try to get published. They send books, their copies here and there, and it gets expensive to do all of the stuff, and it's time consuming. Um, I didn't have that experience. I just was very lucky.
sure.
My second one, I had a similar experience. I had LSU. I sent it to both LSU Press, University of Mississippi, and University of North Carolina. North Carolina, I didn't really expect to get a positive response from them because they are, I think they're more, most of their titles are a bit more arcane and scholarly.
Okay.
And I suppose my title was suggested something a little lighter. So they sent me back a very nice refusal. LSU wanted me, was interested in publishing it, and I think they would have, but they sent back a requirement that I thought was unreasonable. They wanted me to hold it to under 100,000 words.
And
And
what
that
was
meant
it?
I would have had to cut back at least a chapter and a half, maybe two full chapters, which I was really reluctant to do. But, for sentimental reasons, I graduated from LSU. I would prefer to have had them publish it,
Right.
particularly since the physical building where the press is now was my dormitory when I was a freshman.
No kidding.
Yeah, it's now where the press is located. So I went with the University of Mississippi Press because they were also worried about word count, but they didn't seem to be as uh, anal about it as LSU,
Gotcha.
to put it simply.
Sure.
So that's really the only reason, and it's got a good reputation. The presses they only according to what their website says, they publish 80 books a year, and they only accept 10% of their submissions. So I felt pretty honored that 1 in 8 was pretty good, I think. So I went with them.
Sure. All right. You shared with me some time ago that you, I guess we'll call it a part-time job, but riverboat cruises. Tell me
Yeah,
about that. How did you get into that, and what is that experience?
yeah. Do you remember Debbie Lebrano, the librarian at Rummel?
Not offhand.
She was there when you were there. She was
Okay.
the head librarian.
Okay.
She and I are still friends, and she's friends with my wife. And she had a cousin that worked for this group called Road Scholars, ROAD Scholars. It's a tour group. They send people all over the world, literally all over the world. They have tours in Mongolia, and I can't think of a place they don't go, frankly. And her cousin worked for them, and she told her about an opening for someone that they needed on the New Orleans to Memphis American Queen paddle wheeler cruise line to do history talks on the riverboat as it went up to Memphis. And so she suggested me, and this was about the same time I was retiring from my job. I was working, actually, I didn't tell you this, but I was working at um, a charter school. I was working for 5 years at a charter organization when I left the RSD, and I was retiring from that. And then so I picked up on it, and so now I do 7 talks, one a day from New Orleans to Memphis, and that's my job. And it's easy. Once I compile the PowerPoints,
Right.
the rest was easy. It was already in the can, and now all I have to do is present.
And is
So
it
I do about 7 cruises a year.
okay?
Once a year, I go up to St. Paul, and it's a 2-week cruise, and we go from St. Paul down to New Orleans. So that's just once a year. I've done a couple of those.
How is
Uh,
that trip?
It's really wonderful. I mean, people love it. It's a beautiful boat. The American Queen's the largest paddle wheel ever built. It has a capacity for about 360 guests and a crew of almost 200. It's fantastic, and it actually is propelled by a steam paddle wheel engine, along with an electric engine. They share the responsibilities.
Sure.
So it's really beautiful, and it's pleasant. The people are really nice. It's mostly for elderly people because it's on the lower end of the difficulty level. For they grade it, they tell you if you want easy, moderately difficult, and this is on the easy level. So we get a lot of folks that are uh in using walkers and such.
Gotcha.
So it's easy. And then I also do talks in New Orleans as well, because they have tours in New Orleans for a week. People stay for a week and do regular tours, and they invite me in to do talks on certain subjects.
Do you have any specific memory or anything that sticks out from your trip from St. Paul south about river traffic, barge and boat traffic coming through St. Louis, coming through New Orleans?
Yeah, I mean the big difference is are the locks.
Right.
It's really interesting to watch. They generally make an announcement on board the boat if they're going through a lock that's one of the largest, and
Right.
so people go out on the decks and they watch, and it's really an interesting process to see how it works, especially for us down in Lower Mississippi that don't have locks. So
Right.
it's pretty interesting. That's one thing that stands out. Yeah, there's not as much industrial traffic upriver above St. Louis. I mean, you get the petrochemical plants, from Baton Rouge all the way down. So you see that, and you see a lot more barge traffic in the lower Mississippi, but more recreational boating up in the upper reaches of the Mississippi.
Okay. Well, what are you doing with yourself these days? Do you have your eye on a fourth book?
Yeah, I have a couple of ideas, but I have to make sure that there's stuff out there. I
Right.
can't just, I mean, I'm not a novelist. I can't just create stories. I have no imagination whatsoever. I have to have, I really don't. I'm not exaggerating. So I have to have substance. And so I look at myself more as a researcher that can put together what's already there and hopefully make it into an interesting story. But I'm waiting on a few things now to see if this is going to pan out. If not, I have to find something. I got to have something's got to grab me
Right.
before I can put some time and effort into it. Interestingly enough, my time on the riverboat, I spent most of the time assembling um, the chapters and the writing for my last book. I did it in my cabin because
Okay.
I have a lot of time on my hands. I just do that one talk a day, and the rest of the time I'm in my cabin. And so I worked a lot. I put in a lot of time with nothing else to do on the riverboat.
Yeah, the what you did with Whiskey, Women, and War seems to me an insurmountable task. I barely cared to write, 10-page papers in high school and college.
Yeah.
Um, but I guess on a riverboat with nothing else to do,
And yeah, I
I
was
would
kind of
keep myself
forced
entertained
into
as
it.
well.
Yeah, but I like doing it's investigative work.
Right.
It's like being a private eye and
Mhm.
when you come up with a document that, oh my God, it's a wonderful moment because this is going to really contribute to the interest level of your story. It's really something, and and that's happened to me a couple of times when something has come across I open up a folder at the Historic New Orleans collection, and boom, a really wonderful document appears that I can really use. It's exciting. And a photograph, it's another thing you have to search for too, is just the right photograph.
Sure. Well,
And
where can
copywriting is another universe of crap that you have to go through too. When you gotta, there's a, it's in the book. There's a wonderful map of the United States that was the front page. It's a photograph of the front page of Life magazine in 1915, February of 1915, 2 years before we went to war. And it's a photograph. It's a map of the United States with in large letters Germania written across it.
Okay.
And the idea is that the Germans are going to eventually get here and going to turn everything into German. Like New Orleans becomes New Braunfels. Chicago becomes Slaughterhouse, which is kind of clever, I think, but H-A-U-S-E,
Sure.
H-A-U-S.
Sure.
And anyway, so, there was a growing fear. But when I came across that, it was Cornell University was in their archives, but then they wouldn't release it until I got permission from the donor. And I had trouble finding who the donor was before I could get the university to release it so I could put it in the. So things like that, it happens. You have to go to really a lawyer sometimes, a copyright lawyer, to figure out all of the craziness that's going on now with uh, technology the way it is. It's just turned that whole enterprise upside down.
Right.
It's just difficult.
Well, where can listeners find your books?
It's in Amazon, it's in Barnes and Noble. In New Orleans, I like to suggest that people go to independent bookstores, particularly. So in New Orleans, we have three wonderful, at least three that I really like. Blue Cypress on Oak Street, which is a great place, family run. You have Octavia, books on Octavia Street uptown, and then you have the Garden District bookstore on Washington Avenue at the rink. It's a little shopping mall. Those are three really good local bookstores, and fortunately, they have done well since since COVID. I was worried about that, but apparently they all three of them, incidentally, have expanded. They have now more space than they did before the COVID outbreak. So they're doing quite well. So I'm happy to see that.
So share the name of both books again, please.
Both of the
No,
bookstores.
no, no, your books.
Oh, okay. It's the latest one is Whiskey, Women, and War: How World War One, or how the Great War shaped Jim Crow New Orleans.
Right.
So Whiskey, Women, and War is all you need. Do
Right.
a search for it anywhere.
And then is Into the Shadows Furious still in print?
It's not in print. You can find used copies, or libraries will have copies. And some of them are really ridiculously expensive, but because there's not a lot of copies out there. But you can do a search.
Well,
Amazon does a good job with that.
I think last time I checked Amazon, what was the title of your very first self-published book?
It's called New Orleans Goes to War, 1941 to 1945.
Well, there seems to be one on Amazon, and it is a collector's edition price.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, look,
yeah. Go to the
sir.
library.
Right, right. I appreciate your time, sir. I do hope everything goes well with you, and we will keep in touch.
And same to you, Tim.
Thanks a lot.
All right, good luck.